I'm from Australia. I know that romance scams are huge here, and many fall victim to the charms of a fake profile and fake romance. My story's no different. I was duped out of 5,000 Australian dollars. It started when I joined OkCupid to try and meet a possible romantic interest. I received an intro from a man calling himself Chris. He said he was from Texas but travels often for work as he was working on a ship which delivers cargo all over the world. In fact, he said he was in Hawaii when we started chatting. He said he was 54 years old. I was 58, divorced, and never had any children. He said he had a daughter who was 19 years old and away at college in New York. He said his wife died from liver cancer in 2017, and he'd been single since and unable to open his heart up, but hoped he could find love online. I'd been single for a number of years and found the dating pool in my town was inadequate. I wasn't the kind of woman to hang out in a pub setting, and I wasn't up for meeting anyone through church, hotels, or any type of organization. So online dating to me made sense because I could get to know someone before meeting them. And being in Oz, I figured if I met someone from America, it would take them some time to come visit. If the relationship progressed that far, it would give us time to get to know each other on a personal level. Chris and I chatted for free back and forth, and then he asked for my email address, which we exchanged. Chris sent me heaps of photos of himself through email, pictures of his daughter, his house, cars, and the ship he was on. He said that he'd be sailing back to Los Angeles from Hawaii, and then sailing to Panama, and then back to Los Angeles where his port was. He did tell me he sailed to Australia before to deliver oil and other precious cargo, but never had the opportunity to explore the country. I live in Melbourne, and shared with him my beautiful city through pictures. He wrote very well and he seemed to be well educated, and he explained his job to me and his full story of his life. He said that he was born in Iceland to Icelandic parents, but that his parents came to the United States when he was 14 years old, and his dad was a doctor, and they lived in Texas. His last name was an Icelandic name as I looked it up online. It was quite unusual. I admit he was quite the charmer. He never failed to tell me how beautiful I was and how he was enchanted by my emails. He said I had awakened and stirred within him romance and love, something he said he had not felt since he lost his late wife. When Chris left for Panama, we had been chatting daily through email and we also exchanged phone numbers and we talked on WhatsApp. He would leave me voice notes, but he had actually not called me. He said due to his location on the water, it was hard to get a clear connection, but he would leave me good morning messages every single morning. Chris has concerns with his trip to Panama, though. The company he works for changed his workers at the last minute, and he'd never been in a situation quite like this. He said the workers he had were now all from Nigeria, and that they were on visas learning how to become ship hands, and he'd only had one deckhand who seems to know what they're doing. That was his assistant. He told me his name was David. He told me David was originally from Port Harcourt, Nigeria, but that he'd been working on ships for years and really knew what he was doing. He said the other ship helpers were irresponsible. One of them even left important gas tanks running when it should have been shut off and nearly caused a fire. I told Chris not to worry, that he was a professional captain. He just needed to get through this and get back to the port of Los Angeles. Chris told me that he decided to take a cargo load job coming up in 2 months, which would have him sailing into Sydney Harbor. I was excited as he would be docked for 3 weeks there and he hoped we could meet. And while I'm not super close to Sydney, I certainly would make the time and effort to fly there and stay there to meet him. We planned and plotted that whole evening about our meeting. I was so excited at the thought of meeting this man. Maybe it would turn into a committed relationship. Maybe he'd move to Australia. Who really knew? As Chris sailed to Panama, the problems kept coming. He said that the workers were rigging the ship to have issues, and that he knows a few workers left some of the fuel lines to leak to try and stall out the ship. I asked Chris if he reported this to his company owner, but he said no, not until they arrived safely in Panama, as he didn't want to make too much of a splash while the workers were all around. He told me that his only working friend, David, was now his security guard, as there was chatters among the other workers that they didn't like him. I was falling in love with Chris. We would send each other voice notes, and he would email me these beautiful poems and his thoughts. It was nice to talk to a man who shares his thoughts with me. Chris surprised me when he arrived in Panama and called me via WhatsApp, not just a voice note. It was a pleasant surprise, and we ended up talking for several hours about our relationship, us, meeting, our life, past, present, and future. This started to become a regular thing while he was in Panama. The night before he was supposed to set sail back to Los Angeles, Chris told me that his boss informed him that he had to take a special cargo delivery to Nigeria. He was to fly to Miami and then board a new ship to Port Harcourt to deliver some construction materials. Chris was upset, and he said he didn't want to, but he said after this trip he decided instead of sailing to Australia, he would fly directly to my town and asked how I felt about him spending an entire month with me. I was so happy. Not only would I not have to travel to Sydney and pay for a place to stay and the cost of flying there, I would be able to show Chris my hometown. I told Chris to just get on with his voyage, and the sooner it was over, the sooner he could come to meet me. Chris told me the workers from the trip to Panama would accompany him on this journey as they're all from Nigeria. He said his friend David would be there too for his safety. I told him it'll be okay and just focus on us meeting. He told me he loved me, and I told him I loved him. I felt so fond for this man. Chris flew to Miami and told me he boarded the ship. He said the workers were not very nice and that he felt nervous, but I kept him in a positive light by having him focus on our meeting. Chris said he would be on the waters for 6 weeks, then fly from Nigeria direct to Melbourne. He even showed me a flight ticket he purchased already for his trip, so yes, it was really happening. Chris told me his internet signal would be shaky on the waters going that far, but he would call and message as soon as he could. It was about 4 days before I heard from Chris, and then a few messages would come in all at once. He said he tried to send them earlier, but they would get stuck due to the poor internet connection on the water. As time went on, he started leaving voice messages and then called me. He said he would have to call me from his resting quarters because the crew was always watching him. He said the ship assistant David warned him that the crew didn't like him and they were jealous of him and all the money he made, and he told him to lock his quarters at night while he rested. It was scary for sure for him, but I told him to stay focused, get the job over, and come to visit me. I was deeply worried for his safety, but again, he was a professional captain who's done this for many years. Things went okay, and he would message me, and it got to be about the 5th week, and he said they were approaching Nigerian waters. He said he was very tired and went for a rest. David was taking over the ship. When he awoke, he said they were in bad weather, and they had to change course to another port. He was at this point a day away from the port they needed, and the weather had taken a toll on the ship, and he said the crew was not maintaining things like they should. I kept telling him he was so close to the finish line and just focus on coming here to meet me. The day they were supposed to dock, I didn't hear from Chris. I was concerned, but figured there was a lot to do: paperwork, docking, safety protocols, and more. I would message him positive messages, make him a few videos of me, and tell him I was excited and waiting to see him when he would come to meet me. That's when I finally got a message from Chris. He said that since they docked in a different port, the port authority had arrested him and escorted him off the ship. He said that he thinks the crew sabotaged the paperwork and that the Nigerian port authority was holding him for fake documents and not claiming the cargo that was on the ship. He says he thinks some of the crew members hid unauthorized cargo, including gold bars that were found in the hull of the ship in the storage space, and that space was supposed to be empty. He was scared and in trouble. He said he didn't know what would happen, but that him and David were both arrested, but that since he is the captain, he would take the most trouble. He said he would call when he could, and I felt helpless. It was 2 full days later when I received a call from a number I did not recognize. It was a man identifying himself as David, which was Chris's assistant. He told me that Chris had been taken to a jail cell and that David was let go due to being Nigerian and only an assistant. He said Chris was being charged with trying to bring gold bars worth over $1 million undeclared into a Nigerian port without proper documentation. David said he tried to warn the port authority that it was the crew and not Chris, but they let the crew go and they fled into the city. Since Chris is not from this country, they're holding him responsible since it's his ship. I told David to call his company he works for and alert them to what's going on, but David said the Nigerian port authority doesn't play nice, and we need to pay off the authority so they can let Chris go. He said Chris would be held in jail for years before a trial. David said he spoke to the commander of the port authority and he said for the price of 4 million naira, which at the time was equal to around 5,000 of my money, David said that I was the only hope to get Chris out of prison time, and that Chris had fallen ill during his time aboard the ship and needed to get out of here to see a doctor soon as he had an infection. It was because the crew used a trap to make Chris fall and he scraped himself on some metal steps. I felt very distraught, and David told me he doesn't have the money, but if I was able to send it to him, he could pay off the port authority, get Chris out of jail. David told me he has a Nigerian bank account, so it would be simple for me to transfer the money to him. Then David can pay them. He said they took Chris's phone away from him too, and they were holding it until they were paid off, or they would just let him stay in prison. I told David that I would help, but wanted David to write me a statement in text stating that I was sending him money to free Chris and the $5,000 I would be sending would be used directly for Chris. Well, David agreed and wrote that he would be accepting the money on behalf of Chris and for his freedom. I transferred the money after David gave me his bank account information. It was to a Nigerian bank, and I sent a screenshot of the transfer as proof. I waited, and David said the money had transferred. After that, I heard nothing. I called David, I called Chris, I messaged, I sent videos, voice notes, everything, and it all went unread. I reached out to a few online sites with regards to Nigerian police and port police for the ships, and was met also with silence. I didn't know what else to do. I tried to get my bank to stop the transfer, but it had already gone through. The only thing they could do would be to close my account and open me a new one in the event that my information had been compromised, but my bank could not give me my money back, and the transfer was gone. They did advise me to contact the Nigerian bank where the money was sent. I did, but was also met with silence. I went online to search for Chris's ship and came across the subject of romance scammers who pretend to be ship captains. Well, that's when I found Chris's pictures on romance scam websites. The photo was taken and stolen from a very well-known ship captain. I'd been duped, and it really made me sick. I didn't know what else to do other than accept that I was the victim of a romance scam. I fell into a trap and it cost me a big chunk of my savings. I never heard from Chris or David again, but looking back, they both had the same accent and they pronounced their words the same, so in the end, they must have been both from the same location. I really made some poor choices, but at the time, I thought I'd found love. I now spend my days learning about these scammers. I filed a complaint with the Nigerian cybercrime EFCC, but at the time and date of this story, I've heard nothing back. Ladies, beware. Don't let a fast-talking romance lead you down the path of being broke. Cheers. We'd like to thank this lady for sharing her story. Unfortunately, ship captains and romance scammers, That story goes hand in hand. Remember, never send money to anyone that you've met online because it can always turn into you becoming the victim of a scam. If you'd like to share your story, you can find us scammingscammers@gmail.com, or you can find us on Facebook, Scamming Cyber Education. You can drop us your story. We can verify it. Any screenshots you have will help us to do that, and then we can narrate it into a video. Remember, your story can help others, and unfortunately, a lot of Australians, both men and women, fall victim to romance scams every day. Until next time, stay safe.